Today we're going to talk about storytelling and how that shapes our beliefs and the power that the narrator has on on our perceptions, our beliefs, and the systems that we develop. And it really stems back from an evolutionary perspective of why storytelling has such a huge impact on the way we see the world, the way we see ourselves in the world, and one of the biggest things is that this idea that we are um, one of the only um, species that can tell story, that can convey message through language and storytelling, and it really highlights our capacity to create and share narratives as a defining feature. And across every culture and era, people have told stories, myths, legends, histories, and all the narratives throughout, from novels to books to music. And they use this as a way to make sense of the world, and the narratives that we create, that we tell, were more than just entertainment value. They were the ability to pass on traditions, morals, things that can shape the way we build our culture and our society. And it carries values, and it can explain the unknown through religion, and it creates shared beliefs that can bond communities. And anthropologists have found evidence of storytelling in the oldest human societies, indicating that telling these tells is a universal experience. It's a fundamental human phenomena, um, that encapsulates all of us, right? From evolutionary perspectives, right? Our ability to weave these narratives may have given us a survival edge. Allows us to create larger social groups and communicate and transmit information and enforce norms and cement group identity beyond what simple facts or commands could achieve. And a compelling story can package complex ideas into memorable, emotional, resonant forms, making them easier to understand and recall. Um, Psychologists note that people remember information presented as a story far more effectively than information presented as isolated facts. With one analysis going over this idea that you can get about 20 times more likely to remember if it's part of a narrative instead of just these individual facts, which we've seen throughout like memory research, and these people that are memory athletes, and their ability to store memory is very contextualized with these palaces that they create that allow them to put things in certain places and create this story, this arc, so that they're able to recall better. And they engage a lot of our circuitry within our brain, social and emotional, and it allows listeners to identify with characters, scenarios. And modern neuroscience also confirms that when we hear a well-told story, our brains exhibit patterns as if we're experiencing the events ourselves, attuning us to the storyteller's message, which is where we can get this group think mentality. And it really does, this ability to tell the story syncs up our minds, and and allows us to kind of couple together and mirror each other, which is a phenomenon that has been shown within the neuroscience. From evolutionary standpoint, most likely emerged as a crucial adaptation of like social animals living in complex groups. British anthropologist Robin Dunbar, he created this idea of the social brain hypothesis, has argued that language and storytelling functioned as a form of social grooming in early human communities, whereas primates solidify bonds by physical grooming. Humans use speech and narrative to achieve similar bonding effects with many individuals. So telling stories around the campfire would release these endorphins and foster this group cohesion and release of neurotransmitters, and that would create this non-physical bonding experience. So as fire came about, there was no longer a need to immediately go to sleep as the sun went down. So we had all these extra hours of time, and what we found is that time that we had, we spent communicating, telling stories, talking about the day, right? That that is something that evolutionarily has been around and been an adaptive strategy for us for survival and for this bonding mechanism. And it's provided an efficient means to transmit knowledge and cultural norms essential for that survival. Early humans faced many dangers and challenges of finding food, avoiding predators, dealing with intergroup conflict, and concrete lessons learned by one person could be passed to others through this narrative experience. And the ability to create a well-crafted story of a successful hunt, a dangerous encounter, could teach the whole group what to do and what not to do in those similar situations without us having to learn through trial and error on our own. And cognitive scientist Steven Pinker noted the apparent paradox that humans spend so much time in imaginary worlds of stories, yet rather than being a waste, this tendency has an adaptive value, kind of like what we talked about when Burkhart was on about Dungeons and Dragons, and when Dr. Olmos was on talking about anime, right? These stories become very adaptive, these imaginary worlds, and they do this by acts of it acts as a simulation for space and for learning. And we see this within dreams as well. A lot of the dream research shows that we have this reduction in inhibition in certain brain areas like the default mode network and the amygdala, and that allows us to safely um, go through these dreams and categorize things in a way that is not inhibited by certain brain areas that we get inhibited by when we're not asleep or when we're not in these creative scenarios. So it allows us to um, map the world and create safety in a world um, through these weird, complex, imaginary thought process that allows us to carry out and fundamentally become less engrossed with negative stimuli throughout the day. And psychologists Keith Oatley and Raymond Marr have likened fiction to a flight simulator for life. Engaging with narratives helps people practice understanding others' intentions and emotions, which translates into better real world social abilities. And this is played out within the research where they've brought in people and from different backgrounds, different ideological leanings politically, and without really expressing which way they were leaning, they just had them have conversations, ask them questions. And what they found within the research is that the more you get to know the person, the more you realize that we have far more in common than we have apart. But the fact that we go in there with these ideologues that allow us to differentiate between us and them creates this story that we told ourselves, creates this identity to where we can't put ourselves in this other person's shoes. And you can see how that can become a problem. But when we're not enveloped in this story that we've told ourselves and these beliefs, then we realize and we have a better understanding and we have more empathy towards the other person. And it finds that research also shows that individuals who read a lot of fiction tend to have stronger empathy and social cognition skills, but it's not really clear. They can't parse out within the research whether or not reading stories makes people more empathic or if empathic people consume more stories. So that's always one of those, chicken or the egg type of scenarios. But as the group size increased in human evolution, maintaining this coherence and cooperation of being able to share these narratives became crucially vital for expansion and growth and liveliness. So the idea that historian Yuval Harari kind of argues within his book Homo Sapiens is that there's this cognitive revolution, and it was marked by the emergence of fictive language, the ability to talk about things that are not immediately present or even real, gods, nations, myths, which enable large scale cooperation among strangers who believe the same stories. You can think about religious perspectives. You can think about the myths that he was saying, and his claims are popularized. They do align with anthropological evidence that the mythical storytelling and even religious rituals appeared as humans formed larger communities. And what's really cool about that is that there is research that certain brain regions are associated with spiritual or religious experiences. So um, as we were evolving, our brain had this spot in it and associated spots that gave us the spiritual and religious experience, almost as if um, we evolved to have this understanding that we need something beyond us, and we need it to be hardwired in our brain in order for us to succeed in a social environment. And that brain area is the temporoparietal junction, or TPJ for short. And it's particularly in the right hemisphere. And researchers have dubbed that area the God spot. And some of the research that kind of builds off of that is there's this research that was done by Michael Persinger, and they used a device that generated weak magnetic fields targeting the temporal lobes. And some participants reported sensing a presence of feeling watched or having intentional or intense spiritual experiences. And they suggested that stimulation of the right temporal lobe could induce sense presence experiences similar to those reported during religious or mystical experiences. And they've seen very similar things with people that have temporal lobe epilepsy. They report religious or spiritual experiences during seizures. And then we also have the default mode network. The posterior cingulate cortex, part of that default mode network, is implicated in self referential thought. Psychedelics reduce activity in this area and are associated with like ego dissolution, which is another hallmark of mystical experiences. So these things are hardwired in us through evolution, and it goes to show that we need these things in our life, and we've evolved those things. There's selection processes that make them very important, but we also know that they can create a lot of divide as well. And I don't think that was something that was really problematic back then, but it is more maladaptive now and in today's society. But in the Neolithic period, there was as the settlements grew, archaeologists see signs of communal ritual structures, and they suggest that this reflects a shift to group level storytelling and um, doctrinal myths that reinforce social cohesion in bigger populations. One key evolutionary benefit of storytelling is its role in moral and normative education. Before written laws or scientific explanations, early humans encoded their ethics and understanding of nature in stories. And Joseph Campbell portrays this really well in his books. The myth of, or I think it's the myth of a thousand faces or something along. He has a bunch of books that go into these mythical experiences and the impact they have, and what he found through analyzing these mythical experiences is that there's a lot of universal aspects and themes involved in them. And he created this concept of the hero's journey, which outlines a common narrative that we see in books and movies today. And when these narratives are not met, um, these books and these movies feel very, very clunky, and they don't do well. And the reason for that is because these arcs, these heroes journey myths are something that is fundamentally in our brains and stored, and that's the way we see the world. So when things are portrayed in that way, it resonates with us and it makes us feel more emotions connected to that. And this arc that he talks about in all books, myths, movies, is there's the departure, there's the initiation, and then there's the return. And you can think of that as the book of the parable son, and the departure, the what goes on, and then his return. Um, and that transcends a bunch of religious texts and a bunch of movies. And he believed these reoccurring patterns reflect archetypal challenges of human life and serve to guide individuals through personal growth and understanding of their place in society. And he described these four functions of myth in human culture as the mystical, which is instilling a sense of awe before the universe; the cosmological, explaining the shape of the world, the sociological, supporting social order and values, and the psychological, guiding individuals through life stages. So these traditional stories help people experience the sacred, comprehend nature's mysteries, learn the community's rules, and navigate the journey from childhood to elderhood. And those functions illustrate how deeply storytelling was interwoven into our belief systems in early societies. And beyond the bonding and the teaching, deception and imagination in storytelling may have created an arms race in human cognition. Um, Enrico Cohen in 2019 proposed that as language enabled people to tell both truthful accounts and convincing lies, there was evolutionary pressure to become smarter listeners and storytellers. So those who were better at spotting false stories or inconsistencies would avoid being misled, and they would gain a advantage in survival. While those who were better storytellers could influence others and garner trust or status, which is why we're so drawn to these charismatic leaders that may not have the best leadership principles, but their charisma draws us in and they can influence us and they can build trust. And the runaway selection for storytelling intelligence could have driven the expansion of our brain's capacity for narrative, abstract thought, and skepticism. And Cohen points out the double-edged nature of storytelling. It has the power to convey truth or to deceive, to build community or to manipulate. And we see this in all shapes and sizes throughout the world now. And this human intelligence may have partly evolved to manage this balance. It lets us reap the benefits of shared narratives without falling prey to harmful fictions. The very fact that we become so immersed in stories suggests natural selection favored that immersion for social learning and cohesion, but also needed to calibrate it so that we don't lose track of reality entirely. And then from a neurobiological and cognitive perspective, we want to always think about like why are stories so sticky in the human mind? And we can think about beyond stories, music and poetry, and some of the first stories in Homer's Odyssey and the Iliad. These were done in poetic prose. They were told by bards and they were told through music and poem. And the reason that transcended and the reason that stuck in time and getting passed on is because with the music, with the way it's put into play, with the way that it is drawn out, right? Those things make it very sticky for us to remember and understand. There's been plenty of times where, I haven't heard a song in a decade, and then all of a sudden it comes on the radio, and I still remember every single word because there's something about that music that creates emotion, that creates memory, and that makes it very sticky within our brains, even though it's not something that maybe we can recall right then and there without that music to kind of remind us. And modern neuroscience and cognitive psychology have begun to unravel how our brains process these narratives, and it reveals multiple systems that make us natural storytellers and story listeners. At the broadest level, there appear to be dedicated networks in the brain for making sense of narratives. For example, brain imaging studies show that listening to or reading a story engages a widespread set of regions beyond just language areas, including those involved in sensory perception, emotion, and theory of mind, which is the ability to think about others' thoughts. So when people hear a descriptive narrative, their sensory and motor cortices can activate in patterns corresponding to the content of the story, which we touched on in the beginning of this episode. So, in one study, volunteers listened to a story while in an fMRI scanner, and the story described a character grasping on object or running. Parts of the listener's motor cortex involved in hand or leg movement lit up, and as if they were experiencing the actions vicariously. So, this neural mirroring helps explain why a well-told story can make us flinch at a hero's pain or feel warm at a character's story. Our brains simulate the events of the narrative internally. Just like a sad movie will make us cry more so than we think we would naturally do. And then a particularly striking neurological finding is this idea of a synchronization between a speaker and a listener's brain during storytelling. So in Princeton, There was an experiment where a woman told an unrehearsed personal story while in an fMRI scanner, and then many volunteers listened to a recording of that story in the scanner. The researchers, led by Yuri Hassan, found that the listener's brain activity closely matched the speaker's brain activity with a slight delay. When the storyteller's frontal cortex showed a spike, the listener's frontal cortices showed a similar spike moments later. This phenomenon was dubbed neural coupling. And with this idea of neurocoupling, it always brings about this debate of free will versus determinism. Do we have free will? And as you can see here, that there's things that show that there might not be as much free will as we think, that there's a lot of determinism in the things that we do, in the actions that we take. So the neurocoupling suggests that effective storytelling can literally align the mental state of the audience with that of the storyteller. So notably, if listeners do not understand the story, like if it was done in a foreign language, that brain coupling disappears. So the study elegantly demonstrated communication in the brain. Success in transmitting a story can be measured as the alignment of neural patterns between people. Such coupling underlies the powerful sense of connection we feel when engrossed in a narrative. It is as if our minds are temporarily running the same program. And then another key brain system at work is the theory of mind network, which involves areas like the medial prefrontal cortex and the TPJ again, which we talked about as that maybe that God area of the brain. And this network activates when we think about the intentions, beliefs, or emotions of others, and it comes online strongly during story comprehension. So even by age of 4 or 5, children develop the ability to follow characters' mental states and stories, which parallels their development of theory of mind in reality. So narratives essentially exercise this capacity. When we follow a plot, we are constantly attributing thoughts and motivations to the characters, predicting what might happen next, feel empathy or surprise based on those attributions. Empathy is a cornerstone of narrative engagement, and research shows that people with higher empathy scores become more easily transported into fictional stories and feel the emotions of the characters more intensely. This empathic engagement is not just a passive side effect. It appears to be one mechanism by which stories can change our attitudes. If a narrative causes us to identify with someone very different from ourselves, it can open up to their perspective in a way dry facts just won't do. And then memory and cognition are also optimized for narrative structure. Human memory is not like a computer database of facts. We talked about memory and some of the mental health disorder podcasts that we've done. And what we do is we encode experiences in chunks through this prediction error machine that often take the story form. So there's usually a beginning, a middle, an end, causes and effects. And the psychologist Frederick Bartlett in 1930 showed that when people are asked to recall unfamiliar information like a folktale from another culture, they unconsciously reshape it into a form that fits their own familiar narratives or schemas, which is probably why we have this transcendence of religious texts or mythologies that have so much carryover into them, is that we just reshape it to fit our environment, our societal norms, and our memory of ways that we can do that. So one experiment, British participants read a Native American legend, The War of the Ghosts, and later retold it. And their retellings omitted or changed details that didn't make sense to them. Instead, they inserted more familiar plot elements. Effectively, they remembered their version of the story that felt coherent to them, which is why nowadays eyewitness testimony is something that just doesn't really hold up in court anymore, because we know that there's so many incongruencies unconsciously in memory and memory formation. So this indicates that like we remember the gist of the stories and the meaning we derived rather than the verbatim details, and that we rely on the schema, the mental frameworks to reconstruct a story in memory. Again, goes back to these archetypal myths or the collective unconscious that Carl Jung talks about. And these narratives provide an excellent schema, a logical consequence of events with causal links. This is why storytelling helps learning, because stories are easier to remember, and which why um, a lot of our moral landscape is built in religious story, as opposed to just arbitrary facts that are laid out, because that's going to create more buy-in, that's going to create more emotional attachment to those, and therefore we're more likely to follow them out. So there's organizational psychologists, Peg Newhouser found that lessons delivered through story are recalled more accurately and for far longer than the same points delivered through facts and figures. And Jerome Bruner estimated that we're able to remember 20 times through story than standalone fact. And the reason the story sticks in memory relates to how they engaged multiple cognitive faculties. A list of bullet points might only engage our language process and working memory, but a story with imagery and emotion engages visual imagination, auditory process. So we know that memories are stored in multiple areas of the brain through this process. That the hippocampus is definitely the main area for memory formation, but without these other things, those memories become dull, become blunted, and that's why we see these effects with mental health disorders such as depression. We see that these memory areas that create these vibrant emotional experiences, they become dull, they become less active with people that suffer from those mental health disorders, which is why their memories are more negatively valence. So even if there was positive things in their life, they're going to remember them as negative, because these brain areas aren't interacting like we want them to. And this rich encoding creates many pathways to recall information later. And stories often encapsulate a cause and effect, which our brains are adept at encoding as it helps us predict and navigate the world. So, in evolutionary terms, remembering the story about which berries made someone sick is far more useful than remembering a random list of plant names. So, our memory prioritizes narrative, event based information. And then from a neurochemical perspective, storytelling can trigger the release of hormones and neurotransmitters that enhance attention and empathy. Researchers have found that a tense, dramatic narrative can increase cortisol, and that can heighten focus on what's happening. And a moving, character driven narrative can elevate oxytocin, which promotes feelings of connection and empathy towards the characters. And that's why we find ourselves constantly rooting for single individuals in stories, whether they're the bad guy or the good guy, because that connection allows us to drive toward them and cheer for them. And then these neurochemical responses mean that a listener in the grip of a good story is literally under the influence of brain chemicals that make them more receptive to the narrative and the ideas it contains. And once transported into a story, people tend to suspend some of their critical faculty, not in a pathological way, but in a willing acceptance of narrative premise. We sometimes call this suspension of disbelief. So, in fact, experiments confirm that when information is labeled as fiction, people let their guard down and engage with less analytically, potentially allowing the story to slip past rational resistance. That's why in these fantasy movies or in these action movies where things just don't make sense, we go into them with this understanding that they're not going to make sense, so that we don't necessarily have to make it align with the real world that we're in. And that allows us to enjoy these movies. One study showed that labeling a passage fiction led participants to be less critical and more accepting of its contents, whereas labeling the same passage fact made them scrutinize it more. So this again points to distinct cognitive mindsets, a narrative mode where we absorb meaning holistically, and an analytical mode where we parse arguments. Both have their place, but the narrative mode is more primal and emotionally potent. And then how does this relate to belief and perception? Stories do not merely just reflect our beliefs, they actively begin to shape them. And a compelling narrative or narrator can alter what we consider true, important, or morally right. And that comes down to this idea of narrative persuasion and transportation. One of the most researched mechanism of story influence is called narrative transportation. the immersive mental state of being lost in a story. When people are transported by a narrative, they become less aware of their surroundings and more emotionally invested in the plot and characters. Melanie Green and Timothy Brock, who developed the transportation theory, found that more transported people are, the more the story can change their beliefs in line with the narrative. Essentially, a well-told story draws you in and subtly opens you up to accept the storyteller's underlying message. So an audience can deeply absorb a fictional drama about climate change, may come away with stronger environmental beliefs, even if they started out skeptical. A documentary that came out. I forget the name of it, a little while ago, that was around vegan and veganism with athletes. And I think Arnold Schwarzenegger was in it, and they had all these famous people in it, and that really shaped that narrative. And we saw that within the time frame of that movie coming out, a lot more people were trying vegan diets, were trying to do that. And it's like this social contagion of good storytelling. And we see that within the political realm. We see that within everyday life. You can put yourself in those situations and see that comes about. And then Melanie Green's studies showed that familiarity and identification increase transportation. If the story world or characters resonate with the audience experiences, they find it more realistic and become more immersed. So once transported, the usual tendency to counter argue or critically evaluate is reduced. Again, this gets into this whole capture of ideology and beliefs, and that we're always going to look for the answers that fit our narrative and fit our belief system. And if the storyteller is very good at doing that, they're going to be able to capture us to where we no longer question the things that we hear. And I'm sure that sounds familiar for a lot of you out there listening. So, in one study, participants exposed to a narrative advertisement responded more positively than those given a purely factual ad, indicating that they were persuaded through the story rather than the logical considerations of product features, which is why you see when these pharmaceutical companies put out these commercials, you're inundated with usually vibrant people, happy people making their way through life with their family, and you're constantly transported to this idea that these pharmaceutical drugs are going to make your life better. And while you're watching that, while you're being captured by that, they hit you with the 80,000 side effects that come along with it. But you typically remember the joy and the laughter and the emotional connection to the commercial, as opposed to the side effects. I think it loses a little bit of its value when the side effects last longer than the commercial does. That they need to find a way to either speed it up or cliff notes it to get the full effect. So there's a label and message as a story. Fiction made people more accepting of its contents compared to labeling it as an argumentative essay, going back to Green's research. And they concluded that people accept ideas more readily when their minds are in story mode as opposed to an analytical mode. And this has huge implications for advertising to politics. Those who craft the narrative often wield more influence than those who just present facts. We see this within advertisement and propagandists. Stories have the ability to change minds by appealing to emotions and personal connection rather than direct argumentation. Then we have this idea called framing and perspective, how a story is framed, which elements of reality it highlights or omits can drastically alter perceptions. So they found within research that this framing theory describes how journalists or storytellers select certain aspects of a situation to promote a particular interpretation, which we see that a lot now within the Ukraine-Russia war and within the Israel-Gaza war, right? Depending on what side the journalist is on, that's the way they shape that narrative. So it's very difficult to get a clear understanding of what's going on because everyone is going to be influenced by their beliefs and they frame it in a way to where we only see their way, whether it's conscious or unconscious. And then So the classic definition states that the frames select certain aspects of a perceived reality to make them more noticeable, only simplifying the message to mobilize support. So news media can frame a protest as riots by lawless thugs or as an uprising of frustrated citizens, which we saw with the Black Lives Matter when the protests happened. You had one news group talking about the rioting. We had one news group talking about the protesting. Even though it was the same exact story, is there a way that we can intermingle those things together so that we can get a complete understanding of the narrative? Yes, but does that create does that create more viewers? Does that create more us versus them? Therefore, we're going to spend more of our time, right? It doesn't. It dissolves that ability, and that's why these news organizations they don't they don't do that. Independent media has been covering it better, but these mainstream news organizations do not do a great job of that. So the narrative angle, the perspective, the choice of words leads to opposite beliefs about the protesters. Because humans rely on stories to contextualize information, the first story we hear often becomes the lens through which we interpret later facts. This is revealed to the primacy effect and confirmation bias in cognition. Once a narrative frame, group X is victimizing group Y, is established in someone's mind, they will perceive subsequent events in line with that frame. Here is more evidence of X harming Y. So that you're constantly looking for that to fit that narrative, to fit that confirmation bias. And will downplay or fail to notice the facts that don't fit, which we can all see this play out in today's society more than we would like, especially after this last election. Far more um, divisiveness and disruption, even though the polls and the statistics show that we have more in common than we do apart. And that's just the way that we're wired, and that's just the way that we get taken advantage of in these contexts. So we tend to see what the story leads us to expect. Our sensory perception itself may not change, but our interpretation of those sense data, essentially our perspective, is colored by the stories we believe. So a good example of this is when they brought in and how the narrator and the narrative can shape our beliefs, not only currently but generation and generation and generation. And a good story in this aspect is the story of how they put the books of the Bible together in the early 300s in Carthage. They got together, far removed from Jesus, far removed from um, all that encapsulated within the writing of the Bible, and they decided on which books to put in and which books to take out. And at that point in time, there was a book called the Acts of Paul and Thecla, and the Acts of Paul and Thecla is a second century text that narrates the story of Thecla, a young woman who becomes a follower of Paul after hearing his teachings on chastity and celibacy, and she defies social norms by rejecting marriage, baptizing herself, and embarking on missionary work. The text highlights a narrative where a woman takes on a prominent and active role in spreading Christian teachings. However, early church leaders such as Tertullian rejected that text, partly because it promoted the idea of women preaching and teaching, which was controversial at the time. So they noted that the text was used to justify women teaching and baptism practices he opposed. So this narrator, this person who controlled the narrative, removed that book and instead chose to put in First Timothy. And there's been a lot of debate on the authorship of who actually wrote this book. The first epistle to Timothy, particularly 1 Timothy 2:12 states, I do not permit a woman to teach or to assume authority over a man. She must be quiet. This passage has been central to discussion about women's roles in the church. Many modern scholars question the Pauline authorship of First Timothy, suggesting that it may have been written after Paul's death by another author aiming to address specific issues in the early church. This perspective is based on differences in writing style, vocabulary, and church structure compared to Paul's undisputed letters. So the contrast between empowering the narrative of Thecla and the restrictive instructions of First Timothy reflects these broader debates in early Christianity about women's roles. And this was done by this narrator who just had different beliefs. And through that process, you can see how, as the Bible was created, how it created this narrative of a patriarchal society that we still engross ourselves in today. And you can see how unfortunate that is, but you can also see how powerful that can be and why we fall victim to it. Um, and I think the understanding of these ideas help us to not fall victim to these things. We need to be more skeptical of things. We need to have a very skeptical mind of when we are told something, maybe ask ourselves like, oh yeah, why do I agree with this so much versus why do I not agree with this side? And have this dialogue in our head instead of just blindly following and believing. Um, and there's other stories of this as well. One of them we'll get to with Nazi Germany, but narratives versus analytic evidence. A challenge in modern society is that compelling stories can sometimes outweigh factual evidence in people's minds. Psychologically, this is related to the availability heuristic. We judge the frequency or risk of something by how easily examples come to mind. A vivid story provides a very available example, which can make us believe something is common or likely, even if statistics show otherwise. Jonathan Haidt, or Steven Pinker, sorry, talks about this a lot, how crime rates have significantly gone down. But if you look at the news, if you talk to people, we would have the opposite opinion of that. We would think that crime is on the rise, but it's at a historic low. But our narrative mind is swayed by emotional truth of the story, how it felt. Does it feel like it's low? Um, Not necessarily the numerical truth. Social psychologists have found that personal anecdotes often persuade more than data, right? So we use our feelings, we use our emotions to create this belief as opposed to looking at the hard facts. And again, as you can see, evolutionary, like that's ingrained in us. That's very important, but it's also maladaptive in a lot of ways. And I think that these companies, these organizations understand the psychology behind it and understand how to manipulate us. And we need to make sure that we're able to conceptualize this and move forward and not be persuaded by those things. So you get campaigns that share one individual story of suffering can elicit more empathy and donations than one that cites the large scale of a problem. This is summed up in the saying, one death is a tragedy, a million deaths is a statistic. In cognitive experiments, participants might change their beliefs about an issue, say the danger of a certain disease, more after reading a single survivor's tale than after reading a dry epidemiological report. This doesn't mean people are incapable of rational thought. Rather, it highlights that our default mode of sense making is narrative. The scholar Walter Fisher calls humans homo neurons and proposes that narrative paradigm theory that people inherently approach the world in terms of stories, judging them by coherence. Does it hang together? Or fidelity? Does it ring true to our experiences rather than by formal logic? So if a new piece of information is to be believed, it often needs to fit into a narrative that individuals find coherent and credible. If it doesn't, the person may reject the information or reinterpret it to fit their existing story, confirmation bias. Right? This is how perception and perspectives feed each other in a loop. Our perspective is essentially the story we have about the world, about how the world works. And then this perspective affects what we perceive, what we pay attention to, which in turn reinforces the perspective. So you can see this loop that gets brought about. And breaking a person out of a deeply held narrative typically requires an even more compelling counter narrative. Raw facts alone may bounce off. So this idea of how this works in reality, right? There's propaganda and conspiracy narratives throughout history. Leaders and movements have used grand narratives to shape collective beliefs, sometimes with dire consequences. We have the theory of the Judeo-Masonic conspiracy theory. I don't know if you guys are familiar with this, but its origins were in France. In the late 18th and early 19th centuries, French figures like Augustin Burrell propagated the idea that Jews and Freemasons were conspiring to undermine Christian society. This narrative was further reinforced by the 1806 Simonin letter, which falsely claimed that Jews had infiltrated Freemasonry and were plotting to control Europe. These ideas gained traction in France and laid the groundwork for future anti Semitic conspiracy theories. This conspiracy theory was not confined to France. In Germany, the Nazis embraced and expanded upon these ideas, portraying Jews and Freemasons as enemies of the state. Reinhard Heydrich, a high-ranking Nazi official, viewed both groups as threats to the German race and advocated for their elimination. In Russia, the fabricated document known as the Protocols of the Elders of Zion emerged in the early 20th century. This text falsely depicted a Jewish plan for global domination and incorporated elements of the Judeo-Masonic conspiracy. So despite it being debunked, it was widely disseminated and contributed to anti-Semitic sentiments in Russia and beyond. The Nazis utilized these conspiracy theories to justify their anti-Semitic policies. They organized anti-Masonic exhibitions and propagated the idea that Jews and Freemasons were responsible for Germany's problems. This narrative was instrumental in garnering public support for the regime's actions against the groups. So that's propaganda disseminated a narrative also of Aryan racial purity threatened by Jewish conspirators, bolstered by relentless storytelling in posters, films, speeches. Right? This narrative, though false, took hold of the perceptions of many Germans, framing every economic woe or social change as part of that sinister plot. It shows how a cohesive narrative, repeated often, can override individual firsthand experiences, as many people came to interpret their hardships through the lens of the propaganda story. So part of this conspiracy is the narrative has its own self-sealing logic. Neurobiologically, one might speculate that the reward circuits are involved here too. Discovering evidence that fits one's favored narrative likely releases dopamine, given a sense of validation. If dopamine activity is abnormally high or unchecked, it can even lead to seeing patterns and storylines that aren't there, which is what happens in psychosis. And researchers Fletcher and Frith have noted that when brain dopamine is dysregulated, people may give excessive meaning to coincidences, forming delusional beliefs that get reinforced by internal narratives. The internal storyteller in our mind can lead us astray if it isn't balanced by reality testing. So we have perception versus perspective, which we touched on a little bit, right? The user's question specifically asks how perception affects perspective in the context of storytelling. We can interpret perspective as the interpretive lens of worldview, largely shaped by narratives we hold, and perception as the intake of sensory or factual information. Storytelling often acts as a bridge between raw perception and interpretive perspective. For example, two people might witness the same car accident, the same perceptual event, but their perspectives might differ dramatically if they carry different narratives about the drivers involved. One has a belief that city drivers are reckless, while the other believes that intersection is cursed with bad luck. Each will tell a slightly different story of what they perceived, emphasizing elements that confirm their prior narrative. Over time, our dominant narratives, perspectives can actually influence what we notice. This is akin to the psychological phenomenon of selective attention. You tend to see what you're looking for or expecting. In one sense, perception feeds narrative. A single surprising perception, like seeing something one cannot explain, might spawn a news story or conspiracy to explain it, but far more often, narrative feeds perception. We fit what we see into the stories we already believe. Right? So we have this selective attention, which we can see within the realm of relationships, where if you have someone in a relationship that thinks the other person is cheating on them, they will have this selective attention to whatever that person does. No matter what they do, they're going to find it to be an act of infidelity, and they're going to look and they're going to search and they're going to find what they're looking for, whether it's true or not, because their attention has already been directed towards this idea of this is the truth. So one could say that storytelling hacks our perception by adding context. A trivial example is how a simple narrative can change a visual perception task. So if people are shown ambiguous images or optical illusions and given a story prompt, this is a scene of a family by a river, they will perceive the image in line with the prompt, seeing shapes as a boat or fish that match the story context. eyewitness testimony research, it's known that the way questions are framed, what did the tall man say versus what did the man say, can influence the witnesses remember and seeing, essentially inserting a narrative element um, that the man was tall into the perspective. And we've seen this within the research of they had the line research where they had two lines drawn on a piece of paper, and they brought in one participant for the study, and they had 9 other actors that were a part of the study, that the participant thought were also participants. And the first study goes where they asked the participant first, which line is bigger, and it was pretty obvious, as you can see. You can look it up, you can Google it, that there's a clear delineation between which line is bigger and which one is smaller. So every time the participant was asked first, he got it right, he or she got it right. And then the next part of the study was they asked the actors which line was bigger and which line was smaller. And the actors started to name the smaller line as the bigger one. So by the time 6, 7 of them said that the smaller one was the bigger one, the participant started to question his own beliefs and started to think that, hey, like maybe I'm not seeing this correctly. How can all these other people see this and say this is the right one when I see this and this is not the right one? So what they found at a high percentage, that the participant changed their answer and picked the smaller one after the other actors had picked it, right? So that something as simple and as easy to see as that, we were able to be manipulated based off of the story that the people told. And we see this through the ideas of the Nazis in Germany getting twisted into this idea. And we see this within the Milgram electric shock experiments. We see this in the Zimbardo prison experience. We see this idea that we're easily to be manipulated into doing things out of the context, or to question our own beliefs and our own morals. And it's really not hard to do. And that's it's interesting. It's unfortunate. And I think understanding the perspective allows us to understand how these how we can overcome some of these influences as well. So we're constantly bombarded with narratives, news reports, posts, videos, all vying to shape our view of the world, recognizing that a story's emotional power can distort assessment, or that the first narrative we hear can become sticky in our mind, helps us remain critical consumers of information, right? So we have to understand that these are the processes that we go through, and we have to be able to pull ourselves back and ask these critical questions so that we can overcome getting manipulated and pulled in the direction that may not necessarily meet the facts. And it also highlights the responsibility for storytellers. The stories told in journalism, education, and politics carry real weight in shaping beliefs, and should strive for truth and empathy rather than manipulation. So that's kind of like the basic groundwork of storytelling, and the neural side, the cognitive side, and the evolutionary side of how that shapes us. And in the next episode, we'll go into the mental health side of things, and we'll also go into the applications of storytelling knowledge in modern contexts. So education and learning through stories, along with the ethical ability of storytelling, and how we can use embodied storytelling and narrative and exercise to get us moving in the right direction. So that's what will be in the next episode. And then just to wrap up this one, the idea that human culture is driven through algorithm media of today. Storytelling has been a constant current shaping how we understand reality and ourselves. We trace through multifaceted influences of storytelling on human beliefs, highlighting evolutionary roots, neurobiological underpinnings, psychological mechanisms, and diverse modern applications. The evidence is clear that our species evolved not only to use language, but to organize meaning in narrative form and adaptation that enhance social cohesion, learning, and survival. The very structure of our brain reflects this. The networks that bind events into coherent sequences mirror neuron systems that let us live imaginatively in other shoes, reward systems that respond to emotional arc of a story. Storytelling's impact on belief formation is powerful. Narratives can persuade more profoundly than logical argument by engaging people's emotions and identity. They serve as a vehicle for ideology, for better or worse, capable of spreading enlightenment or propaganda. A single story, skillfully told, can change how thousands think about a social issue or how an individual remembers their past. As such, storytelling is a tool, one that demands responsibility. The pen, camera, truly can be mightier than the sword in changing minds, which is why understanding the narrative influence is crucial in education, journalism, and governance, and why it can often be used to manipulate us and the way we see the world and the way we see people in the world. So I hope that this gives you an idea and an understanding of um, how this comes about and how we can overcome it ourselves and create a better narrative of cohesion instead of divisiveness. So I hope you guys enjoyed this podcast. And like I said, next week we'll go over some more ways that we can use storytelling in a positive aspect to um, move us forward in exercise, mental health, and ethical considerations. So I hope that you guys enjoy and we'll tune in next week.